Eleanor Whitmore sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched the small velvet box in her lap. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the worn wooden surface. In front of her lay a stack of Bill's medical statements, overdue notices, and a foreclosure warning that felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself, but the weight of it all pressed down on her chest like an invisible force. George was dying. Her husband, her partner for nearly 40 years, the man who had held her hand through every joy and sorrow, was slipping away, and there was nothing left to give, not money, not time, not energy. They'd spent everything they had on treatments, specialists, and second opinions. Now, even the experimental therapy that offered a glimmer of hope came with a price tag so high it might as well have been written in another language. But Eleanor wasn't ready to let go yet. Not when she still had something to offer. She opened the box slowly, her fingers brushing against the delicate chain inside. It was her mother's pearl necklace, a gift from her wedding day, a symbol of love, sacrifice, and continuity. Each bead told a story. Laughter, filled afternoons, quiet evenings by the fire, and promises whispered under starlit skies. But now, those pearls represented something else entirely. Survival. With a deep breath, Eleanor slipped the necklace over her head and stood up. Her reflection in the mirror caught her off guard. Dark circles underlined her eyes, her once bright smile dimmed by exhaustion. For the first time in decades, she looked older than her years. Yet, despite the toll this fight had taken on her body and spirit, her resolve remained unshaken. If selling the necklace meant one more day, one more hour with George, then so be it. The pawn shop wasn't far from their house, just a 10-minute walk down Main Street. As Eleanor stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hit her like a slap, grounding her in reality. People passed her on the sidewalk, chatting casually or rushing to work, unaware of the storm brewing within her. She envied their carefree steps for a fleeting moment before reminding herself why she was doing this. Mr. Thompson's pawn shop sat tucked between a bakery and a bookstore, its windows displaying a hodgepodge of items: antique clocks, vintage cameras, and tarnished silverware. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and polish. Mr. Thompson himself emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a gray rag. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore." He greeted her with a nod. "What brings you here today?" Eleanor hesitated, clutching the necklace tightly. Then, without preamble, she placed it on the counter. "I need to sell this." Mr. Thompson picked up the piece carefully, examining it under the light. His expression didn't change, but his fingers moved with practiced precision. "Nice workmanship," he said finally. "Where'd you get it?" "It belonged to my mother," Eleanor replied softly. "Passed down to me." He nodded again, his gaze flickering briefly to her face before returning to the pearls. "Sentimental value aside, I can offer you $50 for it." $50. Barely enough to cover next week's groceries, let alone medical bills. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "It's worth much more." Mr. Thompson shrugged, leaning back against the counter. "Maybe so, but business is business, ma'am, unless you've got someone else lined up to pay top dollar." Before he could finish, the bell above the door jingled, announcing another customer. Eleanor turned slightly, catching sight of a tall man stepping into the shop. He wore a simple leather jacket and jeans, his dark hair streaked with silver. There was something about him, something familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. He scanned the room briefly, his eyes landing on Eleanor with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "I'll take it," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. Both Eleanor and Mr. Thompson froze, turning toward him in surprise. "You'll... what?" Mr. Thompson stammered. "The necklace," the man clarified, walking closer. "I'll buy it." Eleanor stared at him, confusion mingling with suspicion. Who was this stranger, and why did he care about her jewelry? Before she could ask, he continued, addressing Mr. Thompson directly. "How much are we talking about here?" Mr. Thompson hesitated, clearly thrown off guard. "Well, depends on the appraisal. Let's say 3,000. the man interrupted smoothly. Cash. $3,000. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. That amount could cover months of treatment, maybe even the entire experimental therapy. But how could this stranger afford such generosity, and why would he do it? As the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a wad of bills, Eleanor found herself torn between gratitude and disbelief. Was this real life, or some cruel dream conjured by her desperate mind? And then, as if sensing her turmoil, the man met her gaze directly. His eyes were warm, almost kind, but carried a depth she couldn't quite decipher. "Don't worry," he said softly, as though reading her thoughts. Sometimes people just need a little help. Little did Eleanor know, this encounter marked the beginning of a journey far greater than she ever imagined on, that would test her faith, challenge her pride, and ultimately reveal truths about humanity she'd never considered possible. Eleanor left the pawn shop in a daze, clutching the envelope of cash tightly in her hand. The crisp bills inside felt foreign, almost unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. She hadn't expected the stranger, this man with the kind eyes and quiet confidence, to intervene so decisively. $3,000 wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a lifeline, a chance to keep fighting for George. But who was he? And why had he done it? As she walked home, the questions swirled in her mind like leaves caught in a gust of wind. He hadn't introduced himself, hadn't asked for anything in return, just handed over the money and walked out without another word. It didn't make sense. People didn't do things like that, not anymore. Not in a world where everyone seemed to be looking out for themselves. By the time Eleanor reached their house, her thoughts were a tangled mess. She slipped inside quietly, trying not to disturb George, who slept peacefully in his recliner by the window. The sunlight streaming through the glass painted golden patterns on his face, highlighting the lines etched deep into his skin. For a moment, Eleanor simply stood there, watching him breathe. Each inhale, each exhale, was a victory worth celebrating. She placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and sat down heavily in a chair. The weight of the past few weeks pressed down on her again, the endless doctor visits, the sleepless nights spent worrying about money, the guilt of selling her mother's necklace. But now, thanks to that stranger, there was hope. Hope to buy more time, more treatments, maybe even a chance at remission. Or was it? The doubt crept in before she could stop it. What if this was all too good to be true? What if the money came with strings attached? Or worse, what if it disappeared tomorrow, leaving them right back where they started? Eleanor shook her head, forcing herself to focus on the present. Worrying wouldn't change anything. Action would. The next morning, Eleanor called the hospital and scheduled an appointment for George to begin the experimental treatment. When the representative mentioned the cost exactly $3,000, she nearly dropped the phone. Coincidence? Or something more? Either way, she paid the bill promptly, using every last cent from the envelope. With the treatment underway, Eleanor tried to settle into a routine. Days blurred together as she juggled caring for George, managing household chores, and keeping track of mounting expenses. Despite the financial relief, the strain remained constant. Every knock on the door made her jump. Every unfamiliar number on her phone sent her heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this unexpected kindness might come at a price. Then, 2 weeks later, it happened. Eleanor was grocery shopping when she noticed the same man from the pawn shop standing near the produce aisle. He wore different clothes this time, a dark coat and jeans, but his presence was unmistakable. Her first instinct was to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen him. But curiosity got the better of her. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, approaching him. "Do I know you?" He turned slowly, his expression softening when he recognized her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, nodding politely. "We met briefly." "Yes, at the pawn shop," she confirmed. "You helped me. Thank you." He smiled faintly, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting hers again. "No need to thank me. Sometimes people just need a little help." "But why?" Eleanor blurted out, unable to hold back any longer. "Why did you do it? Who are you?" His smile widened slightly, though it carried a hint of sadness. Let's just say I've been in situations where no one stepped up. I wanted to make sure that didn't happen to you." It wasn't the answer Eleanor had hoped for, but it was honest. Still, something about him nagged at her familiarity she couldn't quite place. Before she could press further, he excused himself, disappearing into the crowd. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Restless, she pulled out her laptop and began searching online. At first, she typed random phrases: "stranger pays for medical bills," "unexpected acts of kindness," but nothing matched her experience. Then, on a whim, she searched for images of the man. One photo stopped her cold. Johnny Depp. Her breath hitched as she stared at the screen. The actor looked younger in the picture, but the resemblance was undeniable. Could it really be him? Why would someone like Johnny Depp care about her or George? And if it was him, why hide it? The revelation brought both clarity and confusion. On one hand, knowing the identity of her benefactor explained some thingtious ability to pay such a large sum, his anonymity. On the other hand, it raised new questions. Did celebrities often intervene in strangers' lives like this? Was this part of some charitable effort she hadn't heard about? Over the following days, Eleanor wrestled with these thoughts. She considered reaching out to confirm whether it was truly Johnny Depp, but pride held her back. Accepting help was hard enough. Acknowledging it publicly felt impossible. Instead, she focused on George, whose condition showed slight improvement thanks to the treatment. Still, the mystery lingered, and deep down, Eleanor knew she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. Because sometimes, answers weren't just about closure, they were about understanding. Understanding why someone would choose to give so much without expecting anything in return. And perhaps understanding herself in the process. Eleanor spent the next few days torn between gratitude and unease. The possibility that Johnny Depp had intervened in her life was both humbling and unsettling. She couldn't stop thinking about him, his quiet presence in the pawn shop, his unassuming demeanor at the grocery store, and now, the undeniable proof staring back at her from her laptop screen. But as much as she wanted answers, Eleanor also felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever the reason behind his actions, they had given George a fighting chance, and for that she would forever be thankful. One evening, while tidying up the living room, Eleanor stumbled upon an old photo album tucked away on a high shelf. Flipping through its yellowed pages, she came across a picture of herself and George on their wedding day. Her mother stood beside them, beaming with pride, the pearl necklace gleaming around Eleanor's neck. A lump formed in her throat as memories flooded back the laughter, the promises, the love that had carried them through so many years. Setting the album aside, Eleanor made a decision. If Johnny Depp truly was the man who had helped her, she owed him more than silence. She owed him honesty. Gathering her courage, she drafted a short letter, pouring out her gratitude and expressing her confusion. Then, after hours of hesitation, she sent it to his official fan club email address, hoping against hope it might reach him. Days passed without a response. Eleanor tried not to dwell on it, focusing instead on George's slow but steady recovery. His energy levels were improving, and he even managed to joke with her one afternoon, teasing her about burning dinner. It was moments like these that reminded her why she fought so hard to preserve the life they'd built together. Then, one morning, a package arrived at their doorstep. Inside was a simple envelope containing a handwritten note. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for your message. I don't often speak publicly about my work because it's personal to me, but I wanted you to know that what happened wasn't charity, it was partnership. Your strength inspired me, and I'm glad I could help ease the burden, even if just a little. Please take care of yourself and George. You deserve all the happiness this world can offer. Sincerely, J.D." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she read the words. There was no signature, no grand gesture, just sincerity. For the first time since George's diagnosis, she allowed herself to fully breathe. This wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about humanity, connection, and the small acts of kindness that ripple outward, touching lives in ways we never expect. Encouraged by the note, Eleanor decided to pay forward the generosity shown to her. She reached out to local charities, volunteering her time and sharing her story with others facing similar struggles. At first, it was difficult to open up about her journey, the fear, the sacrifice, the unexpected grace, but soon, she found comfort in helping those who needed it most. George, too, became involved, using his experience to advocate for affordable health care and support groups for families battling illness. Together, they turned their hardship into something meaningful, creating a legacy rooted in compassion and resilience. Months later, Eleanor received another surprise, a phone call from the hospital informing her that George's condition had stabilized enough for him to undergo a new experimental therapy. Though expensive, the doctors believed it offered a real shot at long-term remission. Without hesitation, Eleanor agreed to proceed. To her astonishment, when the bill arrived, it was already paid in full. Attached was a single line scrawled on a sticky note: "Take care of each other." Though she never saw Johnny Depp again, Eleanor knew he was watching over them in spirit, if not in person. His act of kindness had changed more than their financial situation. It had reignited their faith in humanity, reminding them that even in the darkest times, light could still find its way in. Years later, as George celebrated his 5-year cancer-free milestone, Eleanor looked back on their journey with gratitude. They hadn't forgotten the challenges they couldn't, but they had learned to embrace the beauty in survival, in love, and in the unexpected gifts life sometimes brings.